I am in my process of becoming, being, and becoming to become the best version of myself, to reach the highest and truest expression of my soul, to climb the spiritual pyramid and be at the top, above worldly limitations of the heart and mind, to be unlimited, to be fully what it is meant to be in the world, all in the context of African spirituality. Hello there, and welcome to the process of becoming by Siboja Boy. Welcome to another episode. I hope you're keeping well. We are in our second month of 2025 African Spiritual Calendar, which started on the 1st of August. I hope we are still sticking to our New Year's resolutions. How is your New Year going? How is it going? As I open up the podcast, I always start it with the affirmations. And basically, my affirmations, these are the affirmations that I said to myself back in October 2021, where I affirmed to myself that I am in this process and this journey to become the best version of myself. And I thought it was important that to note that all of this becoming is within this context of African spirituality. And so, in this episode, we'll be diving in more on what do I mean by my context of African spirituality. And I'd also like to make a special mention to this book called The Introduction to African Indigenous Spirituality. This is a book by research institution, the African Hidden Voices. I think it does become, I'm not going to lie, it is a tad difficult to try and put into words like your experience, right? And I feel like the book acts as a nice guide to allow, and it also has like a nice framework on how we can clearly explain a spiritual experience and to explain the context of African Indigenous spirituality. With that being said, um, I highly documented my spiritual journey. If this is your first time listening in on Spotify, I am an aspiring African philosopher, and you can check out my YouTube channel called Afro Hub, which is an African Indigenous knowledge hub that explores African Indigenous spirituality, African art, just like the African expression, right? And on my channel, Afro Hub, I highly documented my spiritual journey. But just to give you a rough framework, I am a typical Black girl in South Africa, post South Africa, post colonial South Africa, which is like out, which is like after 1656, which I think that's when Jan van Riebeeck came into the country. So which means that I am born within colonial South Africa, which means that automatically I become Christian South Africa. So I grew up in a Christian home. Um, but funny enough, it was a Christian home and those Christian churches that would mix between Christianity and the African indigenous side, and then they mix it in between. So what does that mean? It means that they follow the some of the principles in the Bible, but then also some of the principles of African spirituality. So that's how I grew up. And then at the same time, I went to a Catholic primary school. So I also learned your Hail Marys, had ash on my forehead. And then at the same time, I also followed African traditions as a child, where at home they would slaughter a chicken, they would slaughter a cow. So you can only imagine, and I've always been a child that is very vocal, that thinks a lot. So for me, it was very confusing. It's like I was living just double lives where on Sunday, I've got the Bible, they're speaking about ancestors, and then at school, they're speaking about Hail Marys, and then at home, I'm also slaughtering for the ancestors. And then I got to a point, I think that was early high school, where I just decided that I'm going to be atheist. Like none of this makes sense. all of this is just contradictory and all doesn't make sense. And I also noticed that like the fact that I had to switch between these and I became a different person. Like if I was at school and these Ash Wednesdays, there's a certain way that you need to carry yourself within the culture of Catholicism, like Catholic culture. And then also there's also a culture within African traditions, and there's also a culture within Christianity. So it's like it was like different me's within these different spaces and I was very confused and I didn't know how they which one was right and why did I have to go on all these avenues? You know what I mean? So I think early high school, that's when I decided that okay, I'm just gonna be atheist, none of this exists. And that's when I actually started to go to a spiritual home. So my family then moved away from the church that was mixing between Christianity and African Indigenous spirituality, and we went to the Revelation Spiritual Home, which was more African church, but at that time, like it was still mixing with Christianity, but more on the African message side. And I think from there, I saw that the message was slowly speaking to me. And at that time, I was about 13 or so. So I saw that the message was speaking to me. And that's when I started to question. When I was 16, I can say that's when my actual spiritual journey started, because that's when I actually um, started to isolate myself from friends. And that's when I started to question my entire existence. There was just this burning question within me that was just like, why am I here? And what is the point of all of this? And I would always look up to the stars and just wonder my place in the world. And I can say that's where the experience started, the gist of it. But just to go back on the context, right, of African Indigenous spirituality, I think it's only fair for us to speak about just spirituality. Like, what do we mean by spirituality? And especially in this day and age where it's always being thrown around to hear about spirituality, chakras, the universe. Like, it's such a hip and happening language. So according to the Introduction of African Indigenous Spirituality book, so you can actually get this book from your exclusive books. You can get it online on Takealot. I highly recommend it. If you'd also like to learn more about African Indigenous spirituality, because this knowledge is not something that is taught in schools, unfortunately, and also not in our normal churches. So when you start this journey, it's actually something that you need to do your own research, which for me is something that I appreciate. I appreciate being able to think critically, being presented with information and being allowed to question, to think critically, to research and to receive your answers, you know? So, yeah, according to the book of An Introduction to African Indigenous Spirituality, a spiritual person, right? So, what do we mean by being spiritual? So, it says that a spiritual person is a person, first of all, that acknowledges the fact that they are a spiritual being. And so, it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that I am a spiritual being and that within me, there are two entities, right? There's physical me that you're looking at, and then there's spiritual me. And also, a spiritual person is a person that acknowledges that there are spirits around them, knowing that I am spirit, I communicate with other spirits, and there are also other spirits beyond me that I cannot see. Um, and then, with the knowing that I am spirit, then this energy, my spirit, comes from somewhere, right? The same way that my physical being comes from my mother's womb. Every human being needs to come from a womb. Also, our spiritual being comes from the spiritual dimension, right? Which is a multi layered dimension. But that's where my spirit comes from. So that's just like the universal part of spirituality, just the acknowledgement that I'm a spirit, the consciousness of I'm a spirit, and that the fact that I'm surrounded by other spirits around me, right? And then also like how do we know? And we say that my spirit comes from the spiritual world, but how do I know the spiritual world? How will I know that there's a spiritual world, right? It's by being in touch. It's about being in touch with ourselves, and also being in touch with our ancestors, right? For our direction and our guidance. And I did say it in one of the videos on my YouTube channel, Afro Hub, in one of the videos where we were really diving into purpose. And we said that to find your purpose and what you here on earth, you need to first connect with yourself, right? Because the purpose is technically your spirit's mission guide. It's your spirit's mission. And without the knowledge of self, like, you can never know why you're here, right? And so, for us to know about the spiritual world, we need to first know about ourselves. And it always goes back to ourselves. It always goes to that knowledge of self. That knowledge of self is such a foundation for it. Knowing your inner being, your spiritual being's identity. And once I start that journey to try and learn myself, to learn my spiritual self, not my physical self, then within me, I automatically also get in touch with my ancestors, the ones that come before me, because my spirit comes from the spiritual dimension, sent by my ancestors to come here to fill a purpose, right? And in religion has got a guidebook, and that's where they follow guidance. Whereas in spirituality, we follow our guidance through the spiritual entities, which is our ancestors, which is the great deities, and all of that, right? Um, and then how do we know that we're receiving the guidance? How do we know that I'm receiving the guidance from my spirit? So that would be like through our intuition, that would be through our inner thoughts, that would be through our dreams. Dreams are very important in the context of spirituality. Right now, we're just speaking about universal spirituality, because that's like the communication between, from the spiritual dimension to the physical world, right? And then just going back to the part of connecting with ourselves, right? Which for me, I feel like that's like the foundation, right? Because once we connect with ourselves, we connect with our ancestors. And then once you have that connection, then you start your spiritual journey. That's when you connect with the other beings and the other entities, right? So having a spirit doesn't mean that you're spiritual, because we're all spirit. We're spirit coming from the spiritual dimension, but that doesn't mean that you're spiritual. To be spiritual is to activate your spirit, um, which gets activated through spiritual practices. That's like receiving spiritual revelations, communicating with other beings, which is through phahla, whether you're lighting incense stick or lighting impepo or lighting your spiritual candles. That's through the spiritual revelations or imfundiso. So the moment you start um, paying attention to the spiritual world, that's when then you stop being spiritual. So being spirit alone is not enough to be spiritual, because your spirit needs to be activated, right? So I am spirit. I'm connecting, I'm acknowledging that I'm spirit. And as I acknowledge that I'm spirit, I'm also acknowledging the one that come before me, which is my ancestors, right? But, and then now that I have this strong connection with my ancestors, in spirituality, there needs to be a physical central being, which is like a person that is on a higher level, that breaks down the messages that we receive from the spiritual dimension. Because remember that these messages are complex, they're not as direct, and they require us to live more in our spirits more than in our physical entity. And at times our physical bodies take over more than our spirit, and so we're not able to interpret the messages that we receive, and we misinterpret them. And so the physical central being serves as the mediator between the spiritual world and the physical world, being the in between between the two worlds, while I also have my connection with my guides. So I'm connected to myself, I'm connecting to my guides, and then I connect to the spiritual central being that connects with the great deity that acts as a mediator between the creator and me in the physical world, right? So that's the gist of just universal spirituality, the acknowledgement of me as a spirit and the acknowledgement of other spirits around me. And then we go into the context of African spirituality. So of African side, right? The context of the African part, right? Because everything in the world works in a specific context. Nothing, I don't believe that there's anything that is objective. Even science itself can be subjective because it also depends on where was it done, who discovered what formula. That also plays a part into um, whether it's mathematics, whether it's physics, even in subjects, there's always a context associated. So it's like even religion, there's a context where um, it focuses directly on Israel. Some religions, there's always a context, right? And so in the African spirituality, that's the context of Africa, right? Which is our identity as the African, and it's our uniqueness that goes beyond our skin. To be African goes beyond our skin. It's in our customs, it's in our way of connecting with our creator, it's in our spirituality, it's in the spiritual beings, our ancestors that we connect to. So this connection is within the context of Africa and within the spiritual beings of Africa, which is the people that I can relate to as an African, right? And African spirituality like informs every aspect of the African person's life, including African culture, because culture is influenced by spirituality, including um, African traditions, including our economy, including our politics, including our family structures and our values and our customs, right? And the difference between tradition and spirituality is that spirituality is alive, is that it's not only in our history, but it is continuous and it's relevant in our current lives. So it started with our spirituality, and then our spirituality informed all our customs. And that's why when we follow tradition first, that's when tradition actually starts killing. And that's why we say that tradition evolves, because if spirituality is alive and spirituality connects with us in our current time and is relevant, which means that it evolves. And if spirituality is the one that influences our traditions, which means that also our traditions were supposed to evolve. Something to think about. So that's the context of African spirituality. Um, and then under the context of African spirituality, again, I mentioned the connection of myself, the connection of my ancestors, but now we're looking at it in the African Indigenous context. So as me, Siphokuhle, as the human, as the my spirit, as me, I have a surname and I also have a clan name. And the moment I mention my clan name, I am speaking of people that are not alive in the physical world. I am speaking of people that come before me. When I speak of Odlamini, Ozizi, I am speaking of people that used to walk this earth but have transcended to the spiritual dimension. And so this context becomes relevant to me in my Africanness, that when I connect in my spirituality, it allows me to tap into my bloodline. It allows me to tap into the power of those that come before me. It allows me to tap into their purpose. And it allows me to also bring in my own individuality as I journey this world. So also in the African Indigenous spirituality context is the fact that they still, as in universal, remember with universal spirituality is just like the broad concept just of spirituality, and then there's the African spirituality. So in the African spirituality there's also the spirit, the physical indigenous spiritual beings, and these are the keepers of ancient wisdom that is hidden in the spiritual world and they're able to see through their eyes, and they're able to see through dreams, they get it through visions, through gifts of telepathy. Because in the African indigenous context, there's the belief that we don't approach the creator directly. So umvelinqangi, umfihlakalo, umdali, we don't approach the creator directly, but the great deity or Izithunywa, they relay the message to the physical central being, who then acts as a mediator between the physical, the spiritual world, and also the physical world. So these people are mandated by the spirit guides or the great deities. So this spiritual central being is mandated by the great deity or the spirit guides, who are then mandated by the creator. Because for us, we don't approach the creator directly. So even the physical spiritual central being doesn't approach the creator directly. Um, and these spiritual central beings, they teach spiritual messages that are meant to restore the African person back into their true, authentic selves, as and back to African indigenous ways. They come every 100 years, and their message is always relevant within the current times, whether it's the political climate, the economic climate, it's always relevant in that current time. So if we go to, I think it was page 20 of the book on the African, okay, let me go into it. So this is not a book review. We will still do the book review, not yet. Page 20. Oh. Oh, okay. So if we go to page 42 of the book, you'll see then all the previous physical indigenous spiritual central beings, right? And these people were all over. Like it's not just for a certain demographic of Africa. Because remember that even within Africa as a continent, there's still a context, right? Within. So, for example, you had Simon Kimbangu, who is a African indigenous spiritual guide from Congo from 1887 till 1951. He was a spiritual leader of what was generally considered like the most important indigenous spiritual movement in the Central Africa that advocated for against, that was like anti-European teachings, right? And then you also had Mr. Simio Ondeto from the 1900s to between 1991 to 1992 of Kenya. So his spiritual teachings were always about giving hope to the suffering, empowering the weak, and he gave them a sense of belonging and connected them to the spiritual world. You also had Nongqawusa from South Africa from 1841 to 1898. Nongqawusa was an African indigenous spiritual guide who spiritually revealed the message from the spiritual dimension that the Xhosa people had been polluted and needed cleansing economically. And that time, the economic climate was around cattle and just farming. And then you also had Kimpa Vita from Congo from 1684 to 1706. You also have Ntsikana from South Africa from 1780 to 1821. You also have Maicheza from Zimbabwe from 1914 to 1960. And you also had the the recently departed the great healer Credo Mutwa from 1921 to 2020. And then there's also the one that I know in this era that we're in, which is Iimboni Utata Uzwilezwe Radebe. So I do encourage research. I do encourage research. I've said all the names. You can go into the book, have a look, and even outside of the book, you can just make your research and try to understand what these spiritual central beings were all about. And basically, that's the gist of it. And not only just research, right? But also the important thing is the experience, because spirituality is alive. It's something that we're living. I'm a spiritual being. The fact that I have a surname, I have ancestors as well. So I also encourage that, also involving your spiritual guides, involving your ancestors in your journey through African spirituality as we embark on this journey, and also understanding the importance of having that physical central being in your journey. Because as much as it's me and my ancestors are guiding me, someone needs to help me understand what my ancestors are saying. And that person will not be Isangoma, because Isangoma is a traditional healer, and they heal. They don't guide, they don't give guidance or spiritual teachings. So it's only through these spiritual teachings that the physical central being gives that I'm then able to connect more with my ancestor, and to also understand the messages that I receive from my ancestors. And lastly, I think from my side, maybe you might be asking yourself, like, why is it important for Africans to go back to African Indigenous spirituality, right? And I mean, I would say from my experience and having to have gone through this chaotic childhood that I told you about, of um, Christian background, Catholic background, traditions, um, it has an impact in how you see yourself and how you express yourself within the world. Representation is important. I think just from us, our side, as a spiritual being having expression in this physical world, representation is important. There's a certain power as an African person that you start to have when you realize that life began in Africa. And if life began in Africa, we can say that Africa is the mother of spirituality. And if Africa is the mother of spirituality, why would we as Africans want to look to other nations when it comes to our connection to the Creator? When the Creator created Africa first. Should it not be the other way around, whereas other nations are looking to Africa on how to connect to the Creator? And if context wasn't important, then on the religious sense, the chosen one wouldn't have had a nation, right? If that didn't matter, why was it important that Mr. J gets born in a certain country and of a certain tribe? Why was that important? It's important for our expression. It's important because we then start to harness our own power, and we will also get to stand in our own power. And also, it's important because this is our way of connecting to the Creator. It's like a language that the Creator has given us, and a pathway to go back to the Creator. And so if I use a different pathway, then it means that I'm using a different language. And that path, would that path take me to the creator? I think it's important how we get to the creator, because that is what allows our spirits to thrive. It's what allows us to stand in our own power. It's what allows us to truly connect in a way that is unexplainable. You can never explain the experience. A person can make examples of what has happened to them, but the experience is beyond. And once you have the experience, there's no turning back. It's like your eyes get opened to a whole new world. And it's like you get to connect with yourself in a whole different way. Yeah, deep. That's where we will stop. If you are listening on Spotify, please do follow and please do comment. I love to hear your thoughts. I love to hear your views. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, please do subscribe and comment down below. And I will see you on my next episode. Bye bye.